Welcome, this is your host, Eric Akopian, and we're here at Matanadaran, one of the centers of Armenian civilization, to talk to one of our nation's most accomplished sons. Welcome to our program, Mr. Afeyan.
Thanks, Eric.
You're here for multiple different reasons, but mostly here for the launch of your Spiritual Revival Foundation, which is your big current project, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to explain to the broader public what this is, what the intentions are, and where you're going with this.
Well, Eric, as you know, we across 2 decades now, we've been involved in a number of different projects ranging from social development, economic, education, health, etc. And the one important project historically has also been Aurora, which is a global humanitarian prize. And through that initiative, we've been exposed to a lot of what happens in different conflict zones and traumas all around the world. In that project, never did we think that what that project's about would actually apply to Armenia. And in 2020, with the war, and thereafter in 2022, with the incursions in 2023 with Artsakh, we found ourselves facing an increasingly traumatized Armenian population. We thought we had put that behind us. We had thought that 100 years ago we had paid our dues. And in fact, it was all back, and both the memories and the reality was back. So we decided to think about what could we do uniquely to rise to the challenge. Of course, people had urgent needs for supplies and medical care, etc. But thereafter, we had a fairly traumatized population. And we thought, well, there are some short-term kind of adopted approaches we could take from other places. But then about a year and a half ago, we started trying to create a new program that could, in a very tailored way, help our countrymen who've gone through trauma, their families, their neighbors, their friends, to engage in a rather familiar journey for Armenians, which is this process of revival. And so you might say, why do we call it spiritual revival? And that's because in a uniquely Armenian way, we thought we needed to mix our history, our traditions, our stories of survival, and the spiritual or the belief part of that with the most modern psychosocial treatments, narrative therapy, etc. So what we've done is we've reached out to many experts in the world to take the most current thinking around what might be helpful for people who have lost a sense of balance and want to find a purpose in their lives, to begin to create their own narratives around their own lives that is rooted in our nation's history, which gives you a reason to believe, a reason to overcome, together with their particular situation. So the Spiritual Revival Foundation is aiming to launch that capability. We've piloted it for the last year or so. We've now been engaged with a treatment of over 1,000 participants, and based on that, we're beginning to take the steps to expand our reach. And it's been an interesting combination of efforts between expertise in pastoral care and the approaches that clerics have used historically with the most advanced psychological approaches. And really what we've seen is that we needed to increase the knowledge of psychological approaches in our clergy, in the ones who participated, and we needed to increase the spiritual awareness because the subjects themselves need that in this context, in the psychologists. And it's been a very interesting marriage.
Well, it's interesting you say that because there's actually a very strong case to be made that this nation, this country, this nation is actually collectively has PTSD, and we've had it from the war in 2020 to the ethnic cleansing in 2023. But as you know, and I'm glad you're approaching this from a very culturally sensitive point of view, because as you know, in our culture, there's great reluctances in many instances to actually seek psychological help, and this is in a way, and the practical side of it is psychological. On a global level, is spiritual. You know, sort of the umbrella is spiritual, but the practicalities are quite psychological. What is it that you're doing? I mean, your organization is to. What is the approach that this does not become culturally alien and people are actually willing to engage? Yeah. And they don't tell you things like Armenians don't do therapy, Armenians don't do groups. Because yes. I've heard all of those things. How do you overcome those cultural barriers?
Yes. So look, I absolutely, we have some unique challenges, and in addition to the ones you mentioned, which I'll come to, we have even another one, which is that we are hypersensitive, rightly so. If you've, as a group, gone through a genocide, as soon as there's any signs of impending genocide, you both have the instinct and the right to overreact, at least as it relates to the rest of the world. We have very low barrier to activation in these things because we've experienced it. And by the way, we saw it weeks after the ethnic cleansing in Artsakh, when in fact Israel underwent the attack from Hamas, and overreact they have done, and partly you understand that unleashed, rightly or wrongly, it unleashed a sense of vulnerability that is all too fresh. So I think it's one, we have to understand that this is deep-rooted. We're not dealing with a recent earthquake or a tsunami or something that happens once in 100 years and you forget about it. This is very fresh in our minds. Now, one thing we wanted to do from day one is to create an Armenianness at the root of the approach. If we went to people and said, it turns out that in Australia, this is what's working with some traumatized group, people would say, well, that's not us. But what we wanted to do is to recognize that if we are anything as Armenians historically, we are survivors. In fact, I think it's more appropriate to probably call us super survivors. Super survivors are the type of weed that you can't kill no matter what you throw at it. And we have become super survivors. And so that experience is familiar to us. And we have the experience to revive, because what usually happens is that if you survive, a subset of people lose their ability to move forward and they get depressed and they get suicidal. A number of people find new meaning in their lives and they revive. And that revival takes you to another step, which is striving and then eventually thriving. I think the experience of the diaspora post-genocide showed that. So what we need to do is to give people a sense that rooted in our Armenian recent experience is the way forward. So that's the first thing. What's been interesting is the male-female distribution. In almost every project I've done in Armenia over 25 years, the big issue has been, how do we get more women involved? In this project, uniquely, the big issue has been, how do we get men involved? Because men have, as you said, generally had the view that somehow it's a weakness to have psychological treatment or even thinking about it. Well, to our surprise, whether it's because of the approach or the need, both of those can drive people to try new things. We've had quite active participation from male participants, and importantly, in groups. We were told unequivocally that both you can't do this kind of thing in a group session, and in any case, Armenians won't subject themselves to group therapy. The answer is both of those are wrong. Again, it might be that the trauma was severe enough that the hopelessness drove them, but what we're seeing is that people find strength in seeing the same troubles, the same misery in the form of another person, so that you feel you're not alone. Then you see some people who've advanced. One of the keys that people have learned, for example, through Alcoholics Anonymous in all over the world, is that when you see others who've gone through it and now are back teaching, that's among the most effective things, because you go, oh, what does this person know that I don't know? I'm going to be in their shoes. So I think it's been, it's no panacea. I mean, this is going to take a while. This is a hard effort, but I'm encouraged. On the other hand, we also are, and everything we've done here has been a learning process. So we did not walk in here with a kind of a methodology that we wanted to implement. We discovered it, we iterate, we keep changing. And so by the time we're done, then this is, of course, our usual Armenian over-optimism. I think we can learn things here that we can take to Gaza, that we can take to other places in the world, and really just show a way in which this can be done. In fact, Aurora, as a network today with over 100 humanitarians who've gone into atrocities, etc., that's a great place to think about how these approaches, not in the Armenian spiritual way, because every location needs a different content, but the rest, I think it could be very modular. So we've got a lot of work to do.
It's quite interesting. I'm going to bring you to a more difficult topic than that, even if you can imagine that to be the case. Many of our nation's sons are still in Baku, in the dungeons of the regime in Baku. The most prominent one being Rúben Vardhanyan, who's been your cohort and co-worker in so many things, and a man who's done so much for our collective Armenian nation. And I know you're deeply involved in efforts to free him and to bring him back to his family where he should be. And I know many of these topics are sensitive because you're dealing with the kind of state that you're dealing with. What is it that you can tell us or share with us publicly, or what is it that you want to advocate for us to do collectively to raise those issues and to force the regime to let our people go, to use an old phrase?
Yes. So look, there's so many different ways to think about this. Ruben individually is a very, very dear friend of mine. I consider him family, and have for 20 some years that we've done everything together. So our families couldn't have been closer. And of course, it pains me to great length individually. And he is also family to hundreds or thousands of people, if not tens of thousands. I've had the fun experience to walk around Yerevan 5-6 times a year with him over the last 20 years. And he gets stopped more often than regular police stop traffic, because he's just, people see him as did for a long time, as a beacon of just great leadership and an exemplary person. For him to then sacrifice all that to go to Artsakh, I think is a tribute to his devotion, that when the situation is no longer supportable, that these people are supposed to be ignored and go into kind of their slow oblivion, that he decided to step in and try to bring initially humanitarian support. Eventually and temporarily, he was asked to get involved in the government of that republic, albeit short-lived. And then thereafter, he stayed there to continue the work that he was doing to help the people. For all of that, he's been punished in incarceration with no charges really being brought. And he's not alone. He's alongside many of the political leadership, if not all, of Artsakh, and many, many unfairly held POWs. Now, what are we to do? Look, the most painful thing about this is that this is what the Turks did 110 years ago in the April 24th episode, which is they cut off the head of the community. And these 8 prisoners, political prisoners, represent the head of the Artsakh community, and all the dreams and hopes and intelligence that went into how we're going to get out of the situation is now sitting in jail. And so it's not that it's those people, it's that what they represent to the 100,000 ethnically cleansed folks that are now desperate refugees, but as well the rest of the Armenian population around the world. So they knew what they were doing. They did not just capture random people. What to do about it? Look, my view, of course, we're doing quite a bit externally in different major capitals around the world. And we're somewhat limited to what we can do, because it so happens that in this period, there's a very delicate peace process that's going on between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And everyone is worried that if they in any way apply pressure to an otherwise despotic regime, that this will backfire in affecting the security of Armenia. And that at the first level is a fair concern. But if you feed into that concern, then you encourage that behavior, and there's no amount of impunity that they can act with that will stop it. What I have said publicly, and when we published a letter very recently on April 24th on this in major newspapers, as well as in private, is the following observation. And that is that the notion that we can achieve peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia that is predicated on the absence of justice, that these people are still in jail, historically, where there are such attempts, you neither get peace nor you get justice. The only way that peace will be accomplished here, that it lasts, is if it's based on first addressing the injustice, whether it's through the prisoners or through how we think about the Artsakh population that's been forcibly displaced. That, to me, is an important part of peace. It should not be viewed as an impediment to peace. It should be an integral part of peace. And so we're going to continue to work. Baku has been chosen as the center for COP29. Their impunity has grown in saying that this is going to be the peace COP, basically, to which Politico wrote an article, Bad Cop, Good Cop, very aptly. And so running up to the COP29, I think there's going to have to be almost a referendum by world powers as to whether they want to condone this behavior or they want to take a position. And we're hopeful, very hopeful, that our neighbors in Azerbaijan and their leadership find it in their self-interest to actually resolve this matter as part of peace. I understand the Armenian government is in a difficult position to take a public position on this, but I sure hope and expect that privately they have this near the top of the agenda for their own use, for their own purpose. If they put it below the line in an agenda, I'm afraid it's going to backfire, because that kind of peace will never last.
We're going to segue from Artsakh and global issues to come to very local ones. We would be amiss, given all the events of the past week or 10 days, not to bring them up. Obviously, you do not get involved in daily politics in Armenia. That's not your job. But as you're talking about this spiritual revival, obviously has a church religious element to it. We have a very prominent church figure that has sort of become a prominent political figure. I'm not going to ask about that because this is a mundane political thing. I want to look at it from a global perspective, from 10,000 meters. You know, that the usual church and state division that is normal in the West is really not within our cultural framework for very specific reasons, because for thousands of years we didn't have a state. In many ways, the church was the state. You know, we've had great figures like Remian Hayrik or many other figures who were essentially brought into politics when that wasn't really even their vocation, but they were forced to do so. And then most of this was prior to Armenian statehood, so there was actually room for that. What do you think is the role of the church? I know many people are cynical about this, but does the church have a role in everyday daily politics, or does the church have a role in being the spiritual voice in very specific times on very specific matters? Where do you draw a line in which, when that's something important to be said, that the church should speak, they do speak and they'll listen to, or they're respected, but they do not get involved on the daily ugliness of who rules what and essentially governance issues? How do you see that distinction, or do you disagree with my description of it and you see it in another way?
Look, you always express your views in a nuanced way, and this is a super nuanced topic. There is no black and white, there is no right or wrong. It's quite circumstantial, but the principles matter. And in a democracy, the people's will has to be respected as to who their leader is and what policies they're setting. That does not stop any member of society to express their views on policy, on the effectiveness of the leadership. That's the job of every citizen. And as far as I'm concerned, clerics are citizens, and accountants are citizens, and reporters are citizens. And so as citizens, what individuals do versus as an institution, to me, are quite distinct. As an institution, I think the church has had a historic leadership role and continues to in our society, particularly because it is the circulating system among all Armenians around the world. If there is one, like the heart pumps the blood, one blood system that connects us all, it is connected through our church. It exists everywhere. It upholds certain values, certain traditions. And so the notion that that institution cannot have views about what is in the interest of the populace that it serves, I think that's also impractical. At an institutional level, a church can express at least its support for justice and for rights. And by the way, the Catholic Church has done that for a long time and still does today. And when they get things wrong, they adjust their behavior, as they have towards homosexuality, as they have towards women serving on a church. These are modern day issues. Those are not only canonical issues. So I think that it's you know, as far as I'm concerned, politics is quite distinct from politicians. Politics is the business of the people. And in many ways, particularly the socially disadvantaged people, the people who need assistance to get by, that has historically been the foundation of a church. And my longstanding advice to the church as well, here and everywhere, has been that they should take on the most difficult, challenging lives and support them, give them the means to actually be able to lift themselves up. And if they did that work, whatever on their behalf can be advocated, I think as an institution can be expressed, but by all means, I think there are limits to that in a democracy. And so it's not for me sitting in Boston, even though I have quite a lot of activities in Armenia, to figure out how that gets sorted out. My advice, though, is that avoiding these discussions and avoiding how we get into the future with a healthy set of relationships between the institution of the church and the institution of the Armenian government, as well as other important institutions, academia, for example, journalism, for example. These are pillars of any modern society. We should have the discussion and figure out, by the way, I'll throw in that the diaspora. It is an unnatural act, in my view, for the Armenian diaspora not to have some ability to contribute to the future of the Armenian state and the Armenian nation. These need to be discussed. So I think the key thing is to depersonalize. This is, you know, all of us do what we do temporarily, and we're custodians of some past. The government's a custodian of a past set of governments. The church is a custodian of pasts. And if we just view our job as doing the best we can in the modern times, I think we'll find ways to find common ground.
That's what they call disciplined humility.
That's right.
I put things in perspective. I'm glad you raised the issue of the diaspora. It's because there's lots of issues, very complicated issues, with this particular government, the diaspora. I'm looking at it objectively, having been a diaspora to move to Armenia. There's plenty of fault, frankly, on all sides. This government, I think, has a sometimes wrong perception of the diaspora and isn't willing to be as solicitous as it should be. And the diaspora sometimes really doesn't understand what statehood really means. But I'm going to ask the reverse question. We've discussed before the failings or the lack of whatever the government here is failing on. And nothing has really particularly changed on that, to be honest. But you are one of the few diasporans that always come and go to Armenia. You're here a couple of times out of the year. And what is it in this particular moment that the diaspora gets wrong about this particular Armenian moment? What is it that they don't grasp here? Because I can tell you from the correspondences that I get, some people are literally living on another planet. They're either hysterical or they have extreme views on one way or the other. The prime minister could do no wrong, or he's an agent of a foreign power. There's just nothing in between. If you're going to put your finger, what is it that the diaspora at this moment needs to understand that you see the least amount of understanding for?
I think the most simple one to me is that name calling and threatening and asking for outright assassinations and the like usually don't produce the desired result. In fact, what they do is they animate and bring the discussion into an irrational sphere, no matter what the issue is. And people tend to do that out of a righteousness that they feel and between what's right and wrong. And of course, everybody who talks thinks that they're right and that the other person's wrong. I think that's at a basic level something that's kind of gone awry. By the way, oddly enough, this is everywhere about every topic. Like, we're living in a backdrop where in the US, the two political parties so I've heard it recently called a kind of this rise of tribalism in the world. Social media is encouraging tribalism. And there is now a rise of a tribalism between the diaspora and Armenia, in that the tribe of the diaspora considers the tribe of Armenia as acting not in its interest and acting in a way that it gives it the right to speak down to and to criticize. You can criticize in a constructive way and make arguments for why alternatives should be considered, or you can condemn as a mechanism of criticism. And I just think I think that Armenia rightly has the view that a patronizing parental approach of the diaspora to Armenia, as though Armenia is a child, is not appropriate 30 years into this journey. Having said that, whether Armenia should be treated as an aging adult or it should be treated as a young, up-and-coming thing, we'll see. But I think everybody has to ask themselves, how can I be most useful? My guiding kind of North Star in this is I always ask myself, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, where do we want to be in this discussion? I think that Armenia's leadership can't possibly think that the diaspora 5, 10 years from now is as uninvolved or even would be less involved than it is today. If it imagines it more involved, then it has to come backwards and say, what did it take to really find a rhythm and a mechanism to speak? And I'll say one other thing, Eric, because I know we have short on time. I've recently been thinking, and I'd love someday to talk to you about this, because I know you think and speak a lot about these things. I've begun to think that the diaspora is heterogeneous in yet another way than the ones we've listed. Old diaspora, new diaspora. In Turkey, they don't consider themselves a diaspora. In Russia, they don't consider. That's the old version. I think the new version is that I consider the diaspora is all about being hyphenated Armenians. But the interesting thing is that there are, for example, in America, Armenian Americans, and then there's a whole lot of American Armenians. They live in the same place, called from USA, but they couldn't be more different. An Armenian American wakes up and goes to sleep as an American of the Armenian variety. The American Armenian wakes up in the morning as an Armenian, takes a look at Ararat, gets the inspiration of the history, and goes about their business as an American version of an Armenian. And by the way, that American Armenian moves to Lebanon, and they adapt a little bit, but they're still an Armenian at the end of the day. understanding what motivates those people, understanding who are the people in the institutions that are speaking on behalf of the diaspora, I would argue most of them are country-specific Armenians, whether it's in France. I happen to know Charles Aznavour very well. You know many Armenians out there. It's interesting to figure out, are they in fact French Armenians or Armenian Frenchmen? I'd love to get us to be more thoughtful about this and figure out what's the right messaging. My input to the Prime Minister on this matter, which I had a chance to give yesterday, is that he also should think in a nuanced way and not paint the diaspora in one brush. There are some truly remarkable, capable people in the diaspora who can't understand what's being told to them because they don't feel the way these other people feel, and we just need to be super nuanced on that.
Well, nuance is the operative word, because if you have a diaspora that stretches from, Margarita Simonian to Kim Kardashian to you, I mean, there are people from so many. It's a fit-all phrase that doesn't work. I'm going to close our conversation with one very specific thing, and I'm going to ask you this because you obviously have a chance to spend time or break bread with world leaders. And one thing that I have to tell you that is very clear to me is they do not understand that the events of last September, the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, is actually going to affect politics in this region for 2 generations. They think that can be wiped away. They think people will forget. Why don't you move on? We'll do this, we'll do that for you. There's almost this patronizing grow up type of thing where, this is just the way it is. No one else can get ethnically cleansed, but you can, but just shut up and deal with it. And that, frankly, that enrages me as a person, not as frankly as an Armenian, it's because someone who cares for justice. Mm-hmm. To me, it's even a higher grade than just simply belonging to a certain group. When people tell you that, and I'm sure they have, because they've told me that, and I don't meet with the same people, I've met with people on lower levels than that. What do you tell them that they don't understand about our history and what this means, and the reason that unless we deal with this issue in a just manner, this is not the end of this matter? What do you tell them?
The obligation of the strong is to try to understand the disadvantaged. And when our history has been replete with power taking advantage of our relative vulnerabilities, and that's our collective memory, when that happens in the modern day, no one should expect anything other than a deep, deep wound. In the US, during the Artsakh blockade, many of us were screaming bloody murder to the State Department and others. They were quite reluctant to believe us. In fact, there was almost this Peter kind of crying wolf part of the response. It was made pieces around the corner. There's a red line nobody's going to cross. We told them emphatically there was a red line that would be crossed imminently, literally days before that Senate testimony and days before it actually happened. And so that you would think that would gain us some credibility. It has not, because people do what's in their self-interest, and the self-interest at this point is that this problem go away. The best way for the problem to go away is to resolve it anywhere the problem is. And so all I can do, and I'll try to do, is to have them care enough at a personal level when they're talking to understand that what I'm saying is a possibility, and that on behalf of these people, they need to think differently. Look, the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative has also given us a very interesting voice, because we've been finding heroes from around the world, really bringing attention and aid to them. And in those worlds, in the human rights and humanitarian world, where a lot of former leaders of countries also are spending time, they're seeing what we are made of collectively, and that for us, the response to a genocide is to prevent another one and to enable those who save other people's lives. The response to a genocide for us is not a counter-genocide. And so I think that gives us a different standing to have these discussions. And I'm optimistic that ultimately, on the one hand, we can't just kind of talk ourselves out of these. We have to get stronger as a country. We have to get economically stronger in order to get at least defensively, militarily stronger. We need to create deterrence. We need to create partnerships. We've got a long way to go. But what we need to understand here, in my view, in Armenia, is that the only thing that matters in geopolitics is if other people have interest in your interests. If they don't have any interest in yours and you're on your own, that's a very vulnerable place. So I think we've got work to do.
Well, this was a wonderful discussion. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Afeyan. Thank you for joining us today at Civilnet.